Hi, I'm glad you're here. Today's story might surprise you, because on the surface it's about male dancers' Vegas lights and the kind of glitzy show you'd expect to see on a wild girls' night out. But underneath all of that is something much darker. This isn't just about entertainment. It's about a man who built an empire from nothing, and how that empire was fueled by greed, paranoia, and eventually murder. We're talking about Chippendales, yes, the iconic male revue show, but not the one they put on stage. The real story happened backstage in courtrooms, in secret meetings, and in one tragic moment, behind a locked door. So settle in, because what started as a fantasy became a true crime story that still echoes through pop culture today. This is the dark and twisted legacy of Chippendales, and you're watching True Crime Echoes. Chapter 1. It started with a joke. I thought this was going to be just another fun night out in Vegas. I mean, when you think Vegas, you think chaos, right? Neon lights, overpriced cocktails, questionable life choices, and male strippers. Well, at least that's how it started for me. I was there with a group of friends. It was one of those, why not let's be spontaneous kind of trips. And somehow I ended up on stage at a strip show getting dry humped by a man who looked like he'd been carved out of marble and oiled within an inch of his life. I'm not even exaggerating. It was ridiculous and hilarious and honestly kind of empowering. There's something about being surrounded by women, just laughing, screaming, feeling free for a moment, not being judged, not having to shrink ourselves. It felt like a celebration of something. I'm not sure what exactly. Femininity, power, absurdity. But that night stuck with me. Not because of the bump and grind theatrics, but because it made me curious. Who came up with this idea? I mean, male strip clubs catering to women that wasn't always a thing. Somewhere, someone decided there was a business in sweaty abs and bow ties, and I wanted to know who. So I started digging, just out of curiosity. That's how I found the name Chippendales. And at first I thought, oh, cute, like Chip and Dale, the chipmunks. But no, this wasn't some cartoon. This was the Chippendales, the original, the blueprint, the muscle-bound empire of male entertainment. A brand so iconic it became a pop culture reference in sitcoms, in calendars, and movies. But here's the part no one tells you: behind the glitter, behind the smiles and flexing and dollar bills, was a string of murders, betrayals, and egos so oversized they couldn't fit on a Vegas stage. What started as a flashy nightclub act turned into a cautionary tale of greed, obsession, and violence. It was the American dream, drenched in oil and sequins, that ended in blood and prison bars. I went down a rabbit hole, and I came out the other side stunned. This isn't just a story about male dancers. It's about the dark side of ambition, about how far people will go when they feel unseen, when they feel robbed, when they think success belongs to them and no one else. And today, I'm going to tell you everything I found. The rise, the scandal, the murders, and the man who couldn't let go of control. So grab your drink, maybe sit back, and let's take it from the top. This is the dark history of Chippendales. Chapter 2. The Rise of a New Fantasy. You know what's funny? When we think about strip clubs, the image that comes to mind almost always involves women on stage. It's been that way forever, women being sexualized, watched, judged, objectified. We've been conditioned to accept it like it's just normal, it's entertainment, it's culture. But flip that around: men stripping for women, and suddenly it feels rebellious, unusual, even taboo. And that's exactly why Chippendales hit at just the right time. Let's rewind a little back to the 1970s. America was in the middle of this cultural revolution. Second wave feminism was in full swing. Women were no longer just quietly baking casseroles and planning bridal showers. They wanted more. We wanted more. More freedom, more pleasure, more space to exist without always being told how to act. And with that came the birth of something we now take for granted: the bachelorette party. Before that, it was all bridal showers, tea, doilies, maybe some Tupperware. But guys, they had the wild stuff: strip clubs, booze, last nights of freedom. And eventually women were like, wait, why can't we have that too? That's where Chippendales came in, but it didn't start off glamorous. In 1975, an Indian immigrant named Steve Banerjee, who later started calling himself Steve, bought a failing nightclub in a not-so-great part of Los Angeles. It was called Destiny 2. And honestly, the name alone tells you how bad it was. Steve wasn't a club guy. He had been working in business gas stations, some corporate jobs. He wasn't flashy. He was ambitious, ruthlessly ambitious. He didn't just want to be successful, he wanted to be the best, the richest, the guy everyone else envied. But his club wasn't working. Destiny 2 was going nowhere. So Steve did what any desperate businessman might do. He started experimenting. He tried magic shows, dinner theater, even women's mud wrestling. And yes, it was exactly as messy as it sounds. Nothing stuck. Nothing really made the place feel special. Until one day Steve met Paul Snider. Now Paul was a different breed entirely. A Canadian hustler with a loud mouth, flashy fur coats, and a taste for drama. Think pimp energy in the most literal way. Paul wasn't rich, but he carried himself like he owned the world, and he had an idea. See, back in Canada, Paul had seen male strip shows mostly in gay clubs. But what if he thought we did this for women, straight women? Girls' night out, bachelorette parties. Give the ladies a fantasy that wasn't built around men watching women, but the other way around. At first, Steve wasn't sure. This wasn't traditional. This wasn't safe. But nothing else had worked, so he said yes. And that's when things started to change. In 1979, Destiny 2 was rebranded. A new name, a new vision, a new fantasy. They called it Chippendales. And no, it had nothing to do with the chipmunk cartoons. The name actually came from a style of 18th century furniture. Elegant, classic, strong. There were pieces of it still inside the old club when Steve bought the place. He figured the name would make the brand sound classy, maybe even a little high-end. Which is ironic considering what was about to go down there. But here's the thing, it worked. The fantasy worked. Women flocked to the club. For the first time, there was a space for them where they weren't the ones being watched, but the ones doing the watching. The dancers wore crisp white collars, black bow ties, and little cuffs around their wrists, the reverse of the Playboy bunny. Instead of hot women serving cocktails, it was hot men. And instead of being expected to smile and behave, the women in the audience were encouraged to scream, laugh, let loose. It was subversive. It was electric. It was new. But like all fantasies, there was a dark side. And it wasn't long before the dream started to fracture. Because behind every great empire is a power struggle. And Chippendales, as groundbreaking as it was, would soon become the backdrop for obsession, betrayal, and bloodshed. But we'll get to that. For now, it was the late 70s. And Steve and Paul had just created something the world had never seen before. They were kings of a new kind of stage, but only one of them would survive it. Chapter 3. Glitter Control and the First Crack. The first time I saw footage of the original Chippendales shows, I laughed. Not because it was funny, though. I mean, the outfits were kind of over the top, but because it felt like a time capsule. The music, the lighting, the way the dancers moved. It was like watching a dream someone desperately wanted the world to believe in. And for a while, people did believe. The women came in droves for birthdays, bachelorette parties, even just to blow off steam on a Tuesday night. The club was packed every weekend. Lines down the street. Flashbulbs. Noise. Energy. It worked. Chippendales wasn't just a show. It became a movement. But movements like that don't happen in a vacuum. They're built by people. And people come with baggage. Let's talk about the power dynamic behind the scenes. Steve Banerjee, the owner, was still running the show, at least on paper. But Paul Snider, the flashy promoter from Canada, was everywhere. He was the one finding dancers, pulling in crowds, acting like the face of the brand. At first, they seemed like an unlikely pair, Steve, the quiet, calculating businessman who played everything close to the chest, and Paul, the walking neon sign, who thrived on chaos and attention. But it worked. Until it didn't. Because Paul wasn't just managing a club. He was also managing someone else's rising star, a young woman named Dorothy Stratton. Dorothy was stunning, blonde, graceful. Only 19 when Paul met her. He pushed her into modeling, then into Playboy. And somehow it all worked. She became Playmate of the Month, then Playmate of the Year. Hollywood took notice. She started acting, getting real roles. Directors were calling, and suddenly, Paul wasn't the most important person in her life anymore. And he couldn't handle that. Let me just say this. I've read way too many cases where a man builds up a woman only to try and destroy her when she outgrows him. This wasn't just about ego. This was about control, about power, about Paul realizing he had created something he could no longer contain. And he hated that. By 1980, Dorothy had fallen for someone else, a respected film director named Peter Bogdanovich. They were working together. Rumors of an affair turned out to be true. And Dorothy Shee was ready to leave Paul. She was filing for divorce. She had moved out. She was moving on. Paul, unraveled. He told friends he felt used, embarrassed, publicly humiliated. His wife, the woman he discovered promoted Molded, was walking away. And worse, she was leaving him for someone with real power in Hollywood. Someone he could never be. On August 14th, 1980, Paul asked Dorothy to come to his place. He said he wanted to talk about money, about the divorce, about the logistics, splitting assets, you know, the usual messy stuff. Dorothy said yes. She still cared. Maybe she thought he was finally being reasonable. But what she didn't know was that Paul had purchased a shotgun just days before. He invited her inside. They talked. He led her to the bedroom. And then, he locked the door. What happened next is something I still struggle to talk about. Paul assaulted Dorothy, then forced her to her knees. And he shot her. Point blank. She died instantly. She was only 20 years old. After that, Paul stayed in the house alone with her body for hours. No one knows exactly what he did during that time, and maybe we don't want to. But eventually he turned the gun on himself and ended his life too. Murder-suicide. The news broke fast. Dorothy was a rising star, a beautiful, promising young woman with a bright future. Her murder stunned Hollywood. It stunned the press, and it sent shockwaves through Chippendales, because Paul wasn't just Dorothy's husband. He was Steve's business partner. And Steve, he handled it the way a man who's only ever cared about money might handle it. He denied even knowing Paul. Seriously. He told reporters they were never really close. Just a promoter. Nothing more. He cut him out of the narrative completely. Clean break, no emotion. And maybe that wasn't just about saving face. Maybe it was relief. Because according to people who worked at the club, Steve and Paul had been butting heads for a while. Paul was messy, unreliable, loud. And now with Paul gone, Steve had complete control. Tragic as it was, and it was tragic Steve saw it as a reset. And in a twisted way, it worked. But the darkness didn't end with Dorothy. It was only the beginning. Because from here on out, Steve Banerjee would stop sharing his vision. He'd stop compromising. He'd build an empire in his own image no matter what it cost. And trust me, the cost was high. Chapter 4. The empire grows and so does the ego. After Paul Snider's death, Chippendales could have crumbled. Honestly, it probably should have. A scandal that big, that gruesome, it's the kind of thing that makes people pull away. But for some reason it didn't. The tragedy stayed in the tabloids for a while, sure. But the club, the show, it kept going. And Steve Banerjee, he kept building. With Paul gone, Steve had full control. No one to argue with, no one to outshine him. But there was just one problem: Steve wasn't exactly a showman. He wasn't a dancer. He wasn't flashy. He didn't understand how to build a fantasy. What he understood was numbers, money, logistics. He could run a business, but he couldn't inspire an audience. That's when he brought in someone who could, a man named Nick DeNoia. Now, Nick was everything Steve wasn't: charming, creative, theatrical. He'd won 2 Emmys for producing children's television. Yeah, weird background for someone stepping into the world of male striptease, but somehow it worked. Nick had this instinct for showbiz. He took the raw chaos of the Chippendales stage and turned it into something polished, choreographed, professional. He gave the show real structure. Before Nick, it was just dudes dancing and slowly taking off their clothes. But Nick added storylines, pacing, mood lighting. He made it sexy and smart. Suddenly, the audience wasn't just watching bodies. They were watching a performance. And it paid off. Demand exploded. People couldn't get enough. Chippendales was the hottest ticket in town, not just in LA anymore, but in New York, Atlantic City, Vegas, even overseas. Women everywhere were showing up in droves, screaming, cheering, throwing cash like it meant nothing. It wasn't just a show now, it was a brand. And here's where things got messy, because success like that, it doesn't stay behind the curtain. Eventually, people start asking who's the genius behind all this, and it wasn't Steve who got the credit. It was Nick. Nick was the one doing interviews. Nick was on the talk shows. Nick was being called Mr. Chippendales in magazines. And Steve, the man who started it all, was watching from the sidelines, boiling. You could see it in the way people described him: cold, paranoid, always watching. He'd created something huge, something no one else had dared to build, and now he was being erased from the story. And that's when the infamous napkin deal happened. According to multiple sources, Steve and Nick had sat down at a restaurant one night to hash things out. Nick had a proposal. He wanted to take Chippendales on tour, take the show on the road. He'd handle everything: the production, the logistics, the creative side. In exchange, he wanted 50% of the profits from all touring shows forever. It sounds insane, right? But Steve agreed. Maybe he didn't fully understand the legal weight of the word perpetuity. Maybe he was desperate, or maybe he thought he'd find a way around it later. Either way, they wrote it down on a napkin. And legally, that napkin held up. It became one of the most infamous handshake deals in entertainment history. Nick got everything he asked for, and then he ran with it. The Chippendales tour was a gold mine. We're talking about $80,000 a week in the 1980s. That's nearly $250,000 in today's money every single week, and half of it, every dollar made from every show, went straight into Nick's pocket, Steve. He was furious. He tried to back out of the deal, took Nick to court, tried to claim it wasn't valid. But the court sided with Nick. The deal was binding. Steve had signed it, and now he was stuck. And here's the thing: it wasn't just about money. It was about credit, about control. Because no matter how much Steve made, he wasn't the face of Chippendales anymore. Nick was. And everywhere Steve looked, he saw people praising the man he now saw as a traitor, a thief who had stolen his dream. And like a lot of men in this story, Steve didn't take rejection well. He didn't know how to share power. He didn't know how to accept that someone else might be better than him at something. Instead, he stewed in it, obsessed, let it rot inside him, and soon that obsession would turn deadly. Because for Steve, Banerjee losing was never an option, and if Nick DeNoia had taken what Steve believed was rightfully his, then Nick had to go. Chapter 5. A Hitman in the Wings. It's strange how quickly resentment can turn into obsession, and how obsession, if left to simmer long enough, becomes something darker, something irreversible. Steve Banerjee had built an empire. He had survived scandal-buried enemies and turned a seedy nightclub into a global phenomenon. But the moment Nick DeNoia became the public face of Chippendales, the moment people started associating the brand with him instead of Steve, something snapped. At first, Steve tried to play the game. He sued. He fought the napkin deal in court. He tried to wriggle out of that 50-50 split Nick had so casually written down over dinner. But the courts didn't care that it was scribbled on a napkin. It was a contract. It was binding. And Nick was winning legally, financially, and in the spotlight. To Steve, it must have felt like watching his own creation being stolen from him in slow motion, piece by piece, show by show. And that's when he decided to stop playing fair. Sometime in the mid-1980s, Steve Banerjee made a decision that would change everything. He hired a hitman. Let that sink in. This wasn't a bar fight. This wasn't a legal battle. This was a man with money and power deciding in cold blood that murder was the better option. That death was cleaner than compromise. The man he hired was named Ray Colin, an ex-policeman turned shady character with a history of making things disappear. Ray had connections, and more importantly, he was someone who didn't ask too many questions. Steve told Ray what he wanted: Nick DeNoia gone. No more interviews, no more spotlight, no more 50-50 tour split. And Ray delivered. On April 7, 1987, Nick was in his Manhattan office, working as usual. He had just wrapped up a meeting. His assistant had stepped out. It was quiet, just another day in a fast-paced life. Then someone walked in, someone Nick didn't know. The man said he had a package to deliver. Nick stood up, probably with a smile, maybe confused but polite. And then, just like that, he was shot once in the face. The killer turned and walked out, leaving Nick dying on the floor of his office. It was brutal, efficient, cold. And for a while, it worked. The police had no leads. The shooter had vanished into thin air. And since Nick had been a beloved public figure, someone everyone saw as creative and charismatic, the motive wasn't immediately obvious. No one suspected Steve, not yet. And Steve. He went back to business. With Nick dead, Steve was able to negotiate directly with the Denoya family and buy back the touring rights to Chippendales. Just like that, the 50-50 split, the thing that had haunted him, was gone. The timing couldn't have been better, because only a year later, in 1988, the original Chippendales Club lost its liquor license and fire permit. They couldn't operate in Los Angeles anymore. The stage where it all began went dark. So Steve shifted the company's focus entirely to touring. No more real estate, no more local operations. Just the road, the money, the brand. And it worked. Again. Steve had everything he wanted. The club was profitable, the tours were making a fortune, the legal battle was over, and the man he saw as his greatest threat was dead. But if this story has taught me anything, it's that people like Steve Banerjee don't stop. They don't feel satisfied. Because it's never really about money or power or even revenge. It's about control, about feeding that gnawing need to dominate, to be the only one at the top of the mountain. And so when Steve caught wind that some of his own dancers were thinking about leaving, starting their own strip show, taking their talents and their audience with them, he panicked. Not because they were better than him, but because he couldn't bear the idea of losing control again. So he did what had worked once before. He made a plan to kill them too. Only this time, things didn't go quite the way he hoped. Chapter 6. Cyanide and Paranoia. By the late 1980s, Steve Banerjee had done it again. He had turned a scandal into success. He had buried his enemies, sometimes literally, and reclaimed full control of Chippendales. He was back on top. But the thing about people who claw their way to power through fear and violence is they never really feel safe. There's always someone new to be suspicious of. Someone else to take out. That's where Steve found himself. Even after everything, after Paul Snider, after Nick Denoya. Steve wasn't content. He wasn't secure. He was spiraling. A few of the Chippendales dancers and an MC were planning to break off and start their own male revue show. Something fresh, independent, and Steve. He saw that as betrayal. He saw it as theft, which is ironic considering how much he had taken to get where he was. But to Steve, this wasn't just a business move, it was war. And once again he decided the solution wasn't a contract or a lawsuit, or even buying them out. He decided they had to die. This time he didn't go with a gun. He wanted to get creative. He mixed up a batch of cyanide, yes, the actual poison, and handed it off to a man he had hired to carry out the murders. The plan was to lace drinks, sneak it into food, something quick and untraceable. Something clean. The new hitman's name, Strawberry. I wish I were making that up. A man named Strawberry holding a vial of cyanide hired to poison former Chippendales dancers. This was real life. But here's where Steve's luck finally started to run out because Strawberry got cold feet. He looked at the vial of cyanide, looked at the plan, and thought, nope. Instead of following through, Strawberry went straight to the FBI. Can you imagine being the agent who took that call? Hi, yes, I'm a hitman named Strawberry, and I have cyanide that was given to me by the owner of Chippendales because he wants me to kill some dancers. Sounds ridiculous, but it was all true. The FBI took it seriously. They launched a full-scale investigation and began tracking Steve's movements, his calls, his associates. They set up surveillance, planted wires. They knew Steve had already gotten away with one murder. They couldn't let him succeed again. But here's the tricky part. Hearsay doesn't hold up in court. The FBI couldn't rely solely on Strawberry's word. They needed proof, hard evidence, a confession, so they put together a sting. They convinced Strawberry, now working with them, to arrange a meeting between Steve and the original hitman Ray Colin, the same man who had allegedly pulled the trigger on Nick DeNoia. The idea was simple: get Ray to wear a wire talk to Steve and get him to admit everything. Of course, it didn't go as planned. The meeting took place at an IHOP in Santa Monica. Yeah, the pancake place. But Steve, he was paranoid. He told Ray to strip down to his underwear in the bathroom. He wanted to make sure he wasn't wired. Ray complied, or so Steve thought. The FBI had sewn the recording device into the waistband of Ray's boxers, but Steve was careful. Too careful. He barely said a word. Communicated mostly through notes that he wrote, showed, then flushed down the toilet. The recording captured almost nothing useful. It was frustrating. The FBI had been this close. So they regrouped. A few months later, Steve left the country. He traveled to Switzerland, supposedly for business. The FBI saw their opportunity and acted fast. They sent Ray over to meet with Steve again, only this time they'd be listening from the hotel room next door. Steve didn't know it, but as he ranted, whispered, and planned, federal agents were pressing their ears to the wall. And that's when they got at the confession. On tape, Steve admitted to orchestrating the hit on Nick. He bragged about how it all worked out in the end, how he bought back the touring rights. He even hinted at fleeing the country if things got bad, saying he had a pilot ready to take him to India. No passport, no trail. He was proud of it. Calm, calculated, almost smug, but he had no idea the FBI had everything they needed. Shortly after returning to the U.S., Steve Banerjee was arrested, charged with murder, conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and more. The man who built an empire out of fantasy now faced reality, and it wasn't pretty. But even as the walls closed in, Steve still had one final move to play. And it was his darkest one yet. Chapter 7. The Final Curtain Call. When the news broke that Steve Banerjee had been arrested, I think most people were stunned but not surprised. It was like the truth had finally caught up with him. This man had been sitting at the top of an empire built on oil, muscle, and glitter, but underneath it all there was rot. And for years that rot had been spreading through jealousy, paranoia, and murder. Now everything was out in the open. The charges were serious racketeering conspiracy to commit murder, arson, and the biggest one, murder for hire, in the case of Nick DeNoia. And the evidence, it was airtight. The FBI had recordings. They had cooperating witnesses. They had a timeline that connected everything from the napkin deal to the cyanide, from the planning to the cover-ups. Steve was cornered. And when you're the kind of man who spent your life clinging to control, being trapped like that, it must have felt like suffocating. He faced up to 26 years in federal prison. That's a long time for someone who had once owned nightclubs, flown first class, and lived like a king. But what probably haunted him more was the thought of losing Chippendales, losing everything he'd built, his brand, his legacy, his identity, because that's what the plea deal required. The government offered Steve a deal: plead guilty and they'd drop some of the charges. In return, he would forfeit his share of Chippendales. Let that sink in. The very company he had lied for, killed for the thing he clung to with everything he had, would no longer be his. It would be taken from him and sold. The brand would live on, but he would be erased from it. And Steve couldn't handle that. On October 23, 1994, the night before his sentencing, Steve Banerjee was found dead in his jail cell. He had hanged himself with a bedsheet. Just like that, it was over. He was 48 years old. Now there's been a lot of speculation about why he did it. Some say it was shame. Others say it was fear. But many believe it was a final act of control, because by dying before his official sentencing, Steve may have ensured that his estate, not the government, would retain ownership of his assets, which means his wife and family could still profit from the Chippendales name. Even in death, he found a way to protect what he believed was his. It's unsettling, isn't it? To think that someone could do so much damage, hurt so many people, and still find a way to win, at least financially. But here's the thing, no one really won in this story. Nick DeNoia was murdered in cold blood. Dorothy Stratton was taken far too young. Paul Snyder descended into madness. And Steve? He left behind a trail of violence, fear, and pain disguised as business strategy. And yet, the brand survived. Chippendales is still around today. still touring, still selling fantasies to cheering crowds. And most of those people, they have no idea what went on behind the scenes. They don't know how many lives were destroyed, so a handful of men could sell the idea of the perfect man in a bow tie. It's bizarre how darkness and entertainment can live side by side. But I guess that's what makes stories like this one so hard to look away from. Because beneath the music and the lights is always something else. Chapter 8. The show must go on. After Steve Banerjee died, you'd think the story would end there. It should have. The founder was gone. His crimes were public. His empire was tainted by murder, greed, and scandal. For most companies, that would have been the final curtain. But not Chippendales. In the months that followed, Steve's suicide control of the company passed to his wife Irene. She'd stayed mostly behind the scenes throughout the chaos, but now she was the one holding the keys to the kingdom, or what was left of it. And in 1994, she made a decision that, honestly, I can't really blame her for. She sold it. The entire Chippendales brand, the tours, the licensing, everything went for about $2.5 million. Now, when I first heard that number, I thought, wait, that's it. I mean, this was a company that was pulling in hundreds of thousands of dollars per week at its peak. It had merchandise, TV appearances, celebrity fans, and yet, it went for the price of a luxury condo. But maybe she didn't care about the money anymore. Maybe she just wanted to be free of it. Because by then, the name Chippendales wasn't just about dancers in bow ties. It was about courtrooms and crime scenes, about betrayal and loss. Irene walked away with what she could, and honestly, who could blame her? But here's the wild part. Chippendales kept going. Like a machine that doesn't know how to stop, it kept grinding forward. The brand moved to Las Vegas, which, let's be real, feels like the natural habitat for something like Chippendales. Flashy, loud, a little shameless. And in Vegas, the show thrived. The crowds never stopped coming. The fantasy still sold. The music played on. They even went international, touring across Europe, Asia, Australia. By the 2000s, Chippendales had visited over 25 countries and performed on 6 continents. All of this, long after the man who created it had died in a jail cell. But here's where things get even weirder. For a long time, no one really knew who owned Chippendales. It was sold to a group of private investors, names not made public. Quiet money, silent partners, people who wanted to profit from the brand without being associated with its baggage. But one name did eventually surface, and it was surprising. Lou Pearlman. If that name sounds familiar, it's probably because he was the infamous music mogul behind NSYNC and the Backstreet Boys. But Pearlman had a darker side too. He was later accused of sexually abusing young men, manipulating contracts, and eventually running one of the biggest Ponzi schemes in American history. He died in prison in 2016. So yeah, even after Steve Banerjee Chippendales somehow managed to fall into the hands of another problematic man, it's almost poetic in a deeply unsettling way. The brand was like a magnet for control freaks, manipulators, and men who saw people, especially performers, as tools to be used. And yet, the audience kept showing up. There's something deeply human about that, I think. Our ability to compartmentalize, to enjoy the spectacle without asking too many questions, to cheer for the fantasy even when we know the truth backstage is a mess. And maybe that's the real legacy of Chippendales. Not just the murders, not just the greed, but the fact that a brand can survive all of that and still make people smile. There's something both fascinating and uncomfortable about that, but the story doesn't quite end there. Because in 2020, years after Steve's death, someone else stepped into the spotlight, someone who carried the Banerjee name. And he wasn't finished with the world of male entertainment. Chapter 9. Legacy in the Bloodline. For years, the name Banerjee faded into the background. After Steve's death, his wife sold off the Chippendales brand, the clubs closed, and the story, at least in the public eye, started to cool down. The world moved on, as it always does. But trauma doesn't just disappear, especially not when it's wrapped up in your family name. And in 2020, decades after the headlines had faded, Steve Banerjee's son stepped forward and brought the story back into the spotlight. His name is Christian Banerjee. I remember the first time I saw his interview. It was in the New York Post. The headline caught my eye, something about the heir to Chippendales starting his own male strip club. At first I thought it was a joke, clickbait, but no, it was real. Christian had grown up largely out of the public eye. After his father's death, his family kept a low profile. And honestly, who could blame them? The Banerjee name wasn't exactly something you'd wear proudly at that point. But Christian, he leaned into it. He said it wasn't about money, or even fame. It wasn't the fact that I wanted to be a stripper, he told reporters. It was my destiny. Destiny. That word hit me. Because if you go back to the beginning of this entire story, before Chippendales, before the dancers, the murders, the empire, Steve Banerjee's first club was called Destiny 2. And here was his son, decades later, talking about fate, about continuing the family legacy, about picking up where his father left off. It was surreal. Christian started a company called Stripendales, a new entertainment venture offering both male and female exotic dancers. Not just Chippendales 2.0, but a broader, more modern brand, more inclusive, more strategic. And I'll admit, there's something eerie about watching the next generation step into the same world that destroyed the one before them. But at the same time, there's also something very human about it. Because for Christian, this wasn't just a business. It was a way to reclaim the narrative, to take back a story that had been told without him. He said he always felt connected to Chippendales, that it lived in his DNA. He was only 4 or 5 years old when Steve died, but somehow the weight of his father's legacy never left. He didn't want to be known as the son of a criminal. He wanted to be the man who resurrected the Banerjee name and gave it a new meaning. But here's the thing. Legacy is complicated, especially when it's built on blood. You can rebrand. You can rename. You can redesign everything. But the truth still lingers in the shadows, in court documents, news archives, true crime podcasts. Christian was trying to honor his father. But what part of his father was he honoring? The businessman, the visionary, or the man who paid to have his rivals murdered? That's the question that lingers. And I think deep down, Christian probably wrestles with that too. Because this wasn't just about reviving a business. It was about identity, family, redemption. It's easy to judge from the outside. But if you grew up hearing half-truths, seeing your father's face in old tabloid clippings, and watching people cheer for a brand he created, how could you not feel like something was missing, like you were missing from the story? In the end, Christian didn't bring back Chippendales. He started something new, different, his own. And whether it thrives or disappears, one thing is clear: the Banerjee legacy didn't die with Steve. It just evolved. And it makes you wonder, is it possible to separate legacy from truth? Or are we always walking in the footsteps of the stories that came before us? Chapter 10. What we choose to remember. When I started looking into the story of Chippendales, I thought I'd be researching a quirky corner of pop culture history. Something light, maybe even a little ridiculous. But the deeper I went, the darker it got. Murder, obsession, betrayal. A man who rose from nothing, chasing the American dream with everything he had and destroying almost everyone in his path along the way. And yet somehow Chippendales is still here. That's the part I can't stop thinking about. Despite everything, the bloodshed, the court cases, the behind-the-scenes manipulation, the brand not only survived, it became iconic. It made its way into movies, sitcoms, calendars, even parody sketches. It became a punchline and a fantasy all rolled into one. And most people never knew the full story. They saw the dancers, the glitter, the bow ties. But they didn't see the fear that ran that business like a second currency. They didn't see how many lives were chewed up in the machinery of ambition, how quickly something built to entertain became something that ruined real people. That's the thing about legacy. We don't inherit it in perfect shape. We inherit it in fragments, glamorized, edited, repackaged for comfort. And when something is fun or sexy or easy to sell, it becomes even easier to forget where it really came from. But I think stories like this matter, because they ask uncomfortable questions, not just about the people who built the fantasy, but about us, the ones who bought into it. What does it say about us that a brand built by a man who ordered a murder can still sell out shows today? that women can still line up to see men in cuffs and collars and not know or care that those symbols are tied to so much more than a stage act. Maybe it's not our job to carry that burden. Maybe entertainment really can exist in its own separate universe. Or maybe we owe it to ourselves to remember where things come from and what it costs to keep them alive. Because for all the sequins and spotlights, Chippendales wasn't just about men taking their clothes off. It was about control, ownership, power. It was about a man who believed the world owed him everything and who was willing to kill for it. And in the end, maybe that's the real story. Not the dancing, not the dollar bills, but the warning underneath it all. The reminder that even the brightest lights can cast the darkest shadows. Thank you for taking this journey with me. This has been True Crime Echoes, and I'll see you in the next story. Chapter 11, Echoes That Never Fade. Even after everything I've learned, I still catch myself thinking about Chippendales in the most unexpected moments. I'll see an old clip from the 80s, the bright lights, the screaming fans, the men flexing on stage, and I'll wonder how many people in that room knew what was really going on behind the curtain. And the truth is, most of them didn't. Most of us don't. That's the nature of spectacle. It's meant to distract, to entertain, to let us forget. And maybe that's not always a bad thing. Life is hard enough as it is. We all need escape sometimes. But when the cost of that escape is someone else's silence or someone else's suffering, it makes you stop and think. And what really gets me is that this wasn't some distant, long-ago case buried in a library archive. This was recent. These were people who lived, breathed, loved, fought. They weren't characters. They were real. Dorothy Stratton, Nick DeNoia, even Steve Banerjee, flawed, dangerous, but undeniably human. They had dreams. They made choices. Some of those choices changed lives. Some ended them. And yet their names have mostly been forgotten by the public. Their stories replaced by glossy images of biceps and bow ties. Or worse, by silence. That's the part that feels the heaviest to me. How quickly we move on. How easily we forget the complicated truths behind the things we consume. Because when I think about Chippendales now, I don't just see dancers. I see a case study in ambition, in unchecked power, in what happens when ego outgrows morality. I see how the pursuit of control can become an obsession, and how in that pursuit people can lose everything, including themselves. I also think about the people who tried to do the right thing. Like Strawberry, the hitman who backed out, who risked everything to go to the FBI and stop more people from dying. Or the agents who patiently waited for weeks, months to get the right recording, who built a case not just for justice, but for closure, because that's what stories like this deserve. Not just shock, not just headlines, but reckoning, a pause, a moment to say, this happened, it mattered, and we shouldn't forget it. That's why I do what I do. True crime isn't just about the crime. It's about the echo it leaves behind in families and culture, in our understanding of what people are capable of, and the echo of Chippendales. It's still ringing. Maybe it always will. If you've made it this far, thank you. This story, like so many others in the world of true crime, isn't just about what happened. It's about why it happened. It's about ego control power and how far someone will go to protect what they think belongs to them. But it's also about the people who tried to do the right thing. The ones whose names are often forgotten, but who helped stop something worse from happening. At the end of the day, this story isn't just about Chippendales. It's about us, how we remember how we react, and what we choose to believe when the truth hides behind glitter and showmanship. If this story moved you, shocked you, or made you think a little deeper about the price of success, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you're new here, welcome. We dive into stories that go beyond the headlines, the ones that still echo years later. This is True Crime Echoes, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, stay curious, stay safe, and don't let the glitter fool you.